Thank you all for being here. Is the microphone working all right? Can everybody hear me fine? So you should have a handout in front of you. Does everybody have that? If anybody doesn't, somebody raise your hand and somebody can bring it to you. I will be referring to the handout from time to time as I go along. I don't use slides, I have the handout instead, just something you can take with you. What the handout has on it is on the front page, an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, and on the back page some references or further reading for anybody who wants to look at the original data or the extended arguments for anything that I will be talking about here today. So I'm going to aim to talk for about an hour with about half an hour for questions and discussion afterwards. If you have questions, please hold them until the question and answer discussion period. So I am an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature. I'm interested in how our human nature came about by natural selection. And for many years, I've been most interested in the nature of human children, and especially in those aspects of children's nature that have to do with their education, that have to do broadly with their drive to grow up, all the instinctive things that they come into the world with, aimed at growing up, primarily play, playfulness. They play at the skills that are important for children to learn. Curiosity, they're motivated to explore the world and figure out how it works and what's around them and what they need to do to be successful in that world. So I've titled this talk, Raising Resilient, Happy Children. And the premise of the talk is that children need increasing amounts of independent activity as they grow from year to year. From a biological perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, the purpose of childhood, or the purpose of the juvenile period for any mammal, is to acquire the characteristics, the courage, and the skills required to be independent of their parents. So up until a certain point, mammals depend upon their parents, and then mammals are free from that dependence. But to become free from that dependence, they need to practice independence, which means that as they are growing from year to year, beginning certainly by age 4, they need increasing amounts of independence. This is the way children have grown up for, depending on which experts you want to pay attention to, for perhaps 1 million years. This is how children grow up, at least 100,000 years. But we, right now, in our society today, are preventing children from growing up in the normal way. We are preventing them from that because we are not allowing them the independence that they need in order to learn that they can solve their own problems, that they can do things, that they are not always dependent upon somebody else protecting them, guiding them, and so on and so forth. We overprotect our children more than children have ever been overprotected in the history of humanity. And that is creating problems. I am absolutely convinced that that is why we are seeing such high levels of anxiety, depression, even suicide among school-age children and especially teenagers today. This is not a problem that has suddenly come upon us. This is a problem that has been gradual really over the course of my lifetime, and I'm going to present a little bit about that. So that's kind of the introduction to what I'm talking about. We need to free our children so that they can learn how to do things independently, which is absolutely essential to their growing up happy and mentally as well as physically healthy. So if you're looking at the handout, I'm going to start off by just talking about play, because a lot of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about independent activity, especially for young children, is play. So what is play? So play is a word that, like a lot of English words, it has a lot of different meanings, and people use it in different ways. So I want to just be clear on what I mean by play. So play is an activity that has the 4 characteristics that I have listed on the handout. The first characteristic is that play is initiated and directed by the players themselves, by the children themselves. So right off you know that an adult-directed athletics game is not play. Something that happens in school where the teacher stands up and says, "Now children, we're all going to play this," is not play. Play is what children themselves initiate and direct. Play is undermined when adults are involved with that, because the purpose of play, one of the major purposes of play, is for children to learn how to create and direct their own activities. That's why Mother Nature designed children to want to play with other children, and to want to do it away from adults, because adults spoil it. By their best intentions, they spoil it, because they want to be helpful. But the whole point is for children to learn how to help themselves. So that's the first. Now notice that I said that play is initiated and directed by the players themselves, but play is also normal play throughout most of the world and throughout most of history is social play. Children want to play with other children almost more than anything else. And of course, there are sometimes they want to play alone, doing something artistic and so on. You want to play alone, you don't want to have to compromise on what you're doing. But for the most part, children are naturally motivated to play with other children. And most play throughout the world and throughout history is social play with other children. That is the kind of play that we are especially depriving our children of, because we're not allowing them to get out, find other children to play with without adults there telling them what to do, which makes it no longer play. So the advantage of social play is that when children are playing together, they have to decide amongst themselves what they're going to play, how they're going to play. They have to negotiate. They have to talk about, watch any groups of children play, whether they're little kids playing a make-believe game, or whether they're older kids getting up a pickup game of basketball or soccer or softball. There's a lot of negotiation that goes on. How are we going to play? What are going to be the ground rules? Who gets to be that? Who gets to pitch? Who gets to be the princess who marries the king or marries the prince? All of this, all this negotiation. Who gets to use this prop? Who gets to use? So one of the things that children are learning in play is how to negotiate. They're learning that if they're going to play with their friends, they have to take their friends' needs into account. They can't just do exactly what they want to do. They've got to compromise. I want to play this, you want to play that. What might we both want to play? The other thing that happens in social play is that children overcome narcissism. They overcome egocentrism, because you cannot be a narcissist in play. It can't be all about you when you're playing with other kids. You've got to compromise. You've got to take into account your playmates' needs. And if you don't do that, there's a natural consequence, which is that your playmates will leave you. They'll go home. They'll, if you and I are playing a game, and I am a bit of a bully, and I want you to do exactly what I'm telling you to do. I want to play it the way I want to play it, not the way you want to play it. You, as a self-respecting child, will say something like, "I hear my mom calling, I'm going home now." And that's the natural consequence to me for being a bully. Not everybody learns how not to be a bully, but most kids, in the course of normal play, learn that to be able to play with kids, you've got to listen to them. You've got to pay attention even to their nonverbal communication as to whether they're happy or not. So one of the things that children learn in social play is how to tell whether their playmates are happy or not. What an important lesson that is. If you can't tell whether your playmate is happy or not, you cannot have a good marriage, you cannot have real friends, you cannot have good work partners. This is perhaps the most important human skill there is for lifelong success and happiness. There's no way to teach this skill, but the way this skill is learned naturally is in self-directed play. The primary freedom in play is freedom to quit. And the freedom to quit is what serves as the guarantee that play is democratic, that you all have to decide together. You have to reach consensus when you're playing. Otherwise, the ones who are not willing to play that way will go home and the game is lost. So that's right off an extraordinarily important purpose of play, independent social play, the kind of play that we are depriving our children of. Second characteristic of play is that it's intrinsically motivated. What that means is that it's done for its own sake. You're not doing it for some reward outside of itself. You're not doing it for a gold star or a trophy or a grade on a report card or praise from a parent or approval from a teacher or ultimately going on your resume for a college application. You're doing it just because you want to do it. That's the aspect of play that sadly makes many adults think it must be a waste of time. We're such a material and reward-oriented society that we think, why would you do something just because you want to do it? Well, you know, there's a couple of different answers to that. One is, what's the purpose of life? If the purpose of life isn't to enjoy yourself, then if you think that there's no point in enjoying yourself, then maybe that would help explain the high rates of suicide among young people. Of course we want children to do things just for fun, just to enjoy life. Take away play and you take away their major source of enjoyment, and right off you have a pretty good explanation for why kids are so unhappy today. So that's one part of it, but there's another part of it that maybe appeals a little bit more to the materialistic side of adults. I've done research among young people who had lots of opportunity to play. They were going to an alternative school where they was understood that they were learning through play, self-directed activities, self-directed in a context where there are lots of other kids over the whole age range to play with. And I've studied the graduates of such a school. I've also studied grown unschoolers. These are homeschoolers where the philosophy of the homeschooling is that instead of imposing a curriculum, you allow the children to pursue their own interests, and you, as parents, facilitate that, and you help connect them to other kids and the larger world. And I've done studies of people who have grown up that way, and what I have found is that in about 50% of the cases, I can see a very direct relationship between a passionate interest that they developed in play and what they are now doing in their careers as adults. Playing is following your passions and discovering your passions. Playing is doing what you want to do, and then you play at a lot of things, and some kids, a good share of them, discover something, I really love to play at this. And as they become teenagers, it evolves into, it's still play, but it evolves more into what we might call a hobby. They become really skilled at it. They become, and then these young people think about, well, is there some way I could make a living doing this thing that I love to do? And I could give many such examples, but that would take more time than I really can spare on this. But in some of the articles on your handout, I give quite a number of such examples. The third characteristic of play is that it is structured. People talk about unstructured play. There's no such thing as unstructured play. All play is structured. Play is not random activity, it's structured activity. But it's structured by the children themselves. It's not structured by some outside authority. Children may play a game that has a structure built into it, when they're playing a board game, or they're playing a computer game, or they're playing a softball game. But they have freely chosen that structure. It isn't imposed upon them. They've chosen to play this game. And most kids, once they get going, feel free to modify the structure. You know, the rules of this game aren't working that well for us, so let's change the rules. So no matter how children are playing, whether we're talking about little children or whether we're talking about older children and teenagers, play is how children learn to structure activities. They learn how to control their impulses. I think there are a number of reasons for why we have the high rates of ADHD that we have among kids today. One of them being that it's greatly overdiagnosed. But I think there's another reason too, that ADHD is fundamentally a problem of not being able to control your impulses. Play is how children learn to control their impulses. Because when children play, they are voluntarily, freely putting themselves into a situation where they are no longer free, where they are voluntarily not free. While they are playing that thing, they're not free to just behave whimsically and randomly. They have to play according to the structure of what we're doing. We're creating a sandcastle. We're building something that looks like a sandcastle. We're having a play fight. We're behaving in a way that we're pretending to fight, but we're not really hurting one another. We are pretending to be dragons, and we have to act like dragons if we're pretending to be dragons. We're in a game where, a little kid's game, where you have to be the pet dog, you have to act like the pet dog. No matter how much you want to talk in English, you have to just say, arf, arf, arf. You have to walk around on all fours, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Children in play control their behavior, and they are learning how to control their behavior. The great Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, way back in the 1930s, he argued, I don't totally agree with him, but he argued that the most important lesson that children learn in play is how to control themselves. How to control themselves so that they're behaving in accordance with a socially agreed upon set of norms and rules. In the case of social play, the rules that the kids have agreed that we are playing by these rules. They're learning how to follow rules. So the fourth characteristic of play is, although play is always structured and it always abides by certain rules that are and guidelines that are in the players' heads, those rules never are so restrictive as to prevent creativity and imagination. Play is always creative. Always when you're playing, there are many choices of what you could do at any given point, and you make those choices. Most play has an imaginative quality to it. You're in a pretend world, a world that is in some ways different from the real world. And so you are practicing in play the logic of hypothesis, hypothetical reasoning. If this were true, then what else has to be true? So imagine, for example, little children playing a sort of a fantasy game, what researchers would call a sociodramatic game. Maybe these are 4-year-olds around the kitchen table. And one of them says, that's a bridge, pointing to the table. Another one says, there's a troll under the bridge. Well, right off, we're in the realm of hypothesis. Hypothesize a table is a bridge, a troll under it. Another child says, well, we better give the troll a cookie so it doesn't eat us. What have we got here? We've got hypothetical deductive reasoning. What logicians say is the highest order of human reasoning. What Jean Piaget claimed children are incapable of until they're 11 or 12 years old. But Piaget was obviously wrong. Anybody who's watched little children knows that little children are perfectly capable of hypothetical deductive reasoning in the context of play. And this is how they practice this high level of human reasoning. This is how they develop the skill that underlies what we call science and what we call all sorts of human logic. So I hope I've convinced you that play is not a waste of time. There's a good evolutionary reason why our children come into the world with such a strong drive to play, and especially with such a strong drive to play with other children. What children learn in play, and I'm going to say this, is more important than what they learn in school. We should never take away children's playtime for the sake of more schooling. We should never take away children's playtime to put them in adult-directed sports, which is not play, which is yet more schooling in a certain sense. I'm not against adult-directed sports for kids who really want it, but let's not confuse it with play. They're not learning the kinds of skills in that they are learning in play, the kinds of things that I've just talked about. None of those occur in adult-directed sports. You might learn how to do the sport in adult-directed sports, but how many people are going to go on with a lifetime where being able to bunt a ball or throw a curveball or being able to do whatever it is you're learning in the adult-directed sport, where that really is an important life skill, a tiny, tiny percent. Again, I'm not against it for kids who really want it, but it is silly to put little kids in that. It is silly to have 6-year-olds in uniforms being taught as if they're little professionals trying to do this. They should be running around, chasing one another, climbing trees, play fighting, doing what kids are biologically designed to do. They will benefit from that way more than they benefit from adult-directed, adult-regulated sporting activities. So I'm now on, I should keep track of the time here. I'm now on E, other independent activity, or B, other independent activities. I want to make the point. So play is sort of the primary for kids, the primary independent activity. But there are other independent activities that we are more or less depriving children of. So one of them is independent mobility. So children want to get around by themselves. They don't want to always be driven around, carried around, bussed around by adults. So this is another thing children have lost. So when I was a kid, a long time ago, and even when my own son was a kid, also a long time ago, all kids walked to school. Kindergartners walked to school. Everybody walked to school. By 5th grade, you could be a crossing guard to help little kids cross the busy streets. Oh my gosh, what has happened? This was exercise. Kids would walk, but my son in the 1970s went to a school that was 2 miles away from us. By the time he was 9, he could go there himself, bicycled there 2 miles away. He could also, we lived at that time in Framingham. If he wanted to go into Boston to go to a museum, he was fascinated by museums. I didn't have to take him. He would take the bus. He would take the bus from Framingham into Boston, go to the museum by himself at 9 or 10 years old. Nobody batted an eyelash about that. This was expected. The world is not more dangerous now than it was then. It truly is not. In fact, crime has gone down. But we have imagined all these dangers. I gave a talk to a school that's very near me, and I have to admit I kind of scolded them. Every day I go by that school. It's a middle school. This is not tiny kids. This is a middle school. And every day there's a lineup of cars spewing out fumes, waiting to pick up their kids. And 90% of those kids live within a mile of that school. They could easily walk home. What are we thinking when we do this? We are polluting the air, we're using our own time picking them up, and we're depriving them of fresh air and exercise that they would get by walking to school and walking home afterwards. There's no reason under the sun that we should be driving our kids to school and driving them back after that. So it's imagined fears that we have, and it's become a kind of a norm that people think they're bad parents if they don't pick their kids up and drive their kids every place. And schools think they're bad schools if they allow kids to walk. We've got to change that because we are harming our children by depriving them, and I say depriving them, of the opportunity for independent mobility. So, let me just, as one index of how far we've gone, when I was 4 years old, I lived in Minneapolis. My mom was a single mother at that time, and my grandma, and she worked, and my grandmother, who was somewhat crippled, was the stay-at-home parent, and I had a younger brother that she had to watch. So by the time I was 4 years old, she would send me out. We lived in a working class district of Minneapolis with lots of traffic, busy streets. She would send me out to run errands at 4 years old to pick up stuff at the store for her. This was not unheard of. I was probably a year earlier than the typical kid who would be sent out, but I was always a little bit advanced, and I was tall for my age, so that I could get away with it. But it would not have been terribly unusual for other 4-year-olds, and not at all unusual for 5-year-olds to be running such errands for their parents or their grandparents. So think how far we've come. If anybody back in the 1950s proposed a change to what we have today, they would think you're crazy. Why would you do that? The fact of the matter is the change has occurred gradually over a 70-year period. So for every generation, it's not that different from what it was before. So we begin to think that what we have today is normal, but it's not normal. It's abnormal. It's a pathological environment for children to grow up in. And it's no surprise then that our children, so many of them, are suffering from anxiety and depression, and why we have such high rates of even suicide among teenagers. So we are now on C, historical analysis. I've already talked about this a little bit. So over the past 70 years, there has been, really since about 1955 was kind of the turning point according to the historian Howard Chudikoff. Since about 1955, there has been a continuous decline in children's opportunities to do the things that children are biologically designed to do. A continuous decline in children's opportunities to just go outdoors and play with other kids, to move around independently, to do things that allow them to practice being independent. And you can look with every decade, children are less free than they were the decade before. So the historian Howard Chudikoff, in his book on play and the children in America, describes the first half of the 20th century as the golden era of children's play, because pretty much by the beginning of the 20th century, we had eliminated the intensive child labor that some children were engaged in, the sweatshop labor, working in coal mines, and so on and so forth. So we had liberated children from that. And in doing so, we returned to children the opportunities for them to be children, to play, to explore, to do those things. But as Chudikoff explains, beginning around 1955, we gradually took that liberation away from children. We didn't put them back in factories, but we put them in schools. More and more time in school. More and more time in adult-directed activities over time. And we began to regulate their lives in other ways. Instead of just going out and play, we gradually, Little League came into existence in the 1930s, but it was not a big deal until the 1950s and 60s. And then we gradually added more and more adult-directed sports, and we thought that was replacing play. After all, they're getting some exercise doing that. And so and parents began to push it, and then it began almost to look like this is something you ought to do to help them get into college. Somehow that's supposed to help them get into college, people think. So we gradually made these kinds of changes. Even the advent of television played a role, because kids began to go home back in the late 1950s to watch the Mickey Mouse Club on TV after school, instead of hanging around outdoors and playing until supper time. So a whole set of changes. In my new book, I have a whole chapter on about 15 different societal changes that took away, that gradually chipped away at children's freedom to play and explore. So over this same period of time, so I might say just in terms of schooling. So I looked up the data. If you compare the school year when I was in elementary school in the 1950s with today, we have added 5 full weeks of extra school time to the school day. In the 1950s, we had a whole extra month in the summer and another week in the year. If you add homework into that, there was no homework, at least at the elementary schools that I went to in the 1950s. We've added homework even for little kids dragging stuff home. They're not even free from school when they're home. Everybody would have been appalled by that idea in the 1950s. It just wouldn't fly. You can't do this to kids. They need free time. They need to play. When they're home, they should be home. And they should be allowed to play and do things that kids are supposed to do. We began to get parents increasingly involved in schooling. So parents became assistant teachers. You go home and you're still at school because your parent is nagging you about your homework, and so on and so forth. And then we kind of blame parents if the kids don't do their homework. We hold parents responsible. We bring them in for parent-teachers conferences as if it's the parents who are supposed to make sure the kids are doing their homework. It's no longer the kids' responsibility, it's now the parents' responsibility. All of these kinds of changes have occurred gradually. They would not have been accepted if they all occurred all at the same time. And then we began especially beginning around 1980, we developed this irrational fear called stranger danger. And I say irrational fear because the occurrence of snatching a child away by a stranger is almost negligible. It occurs, yeah, I mean, there's millions and millions of kids out there. And every once in a while it occurs, but it's an extraordinarily rare event. Almost all the kids that are snatched away by relatives. It's that ex-spouse who thinks that they have the kid, or it's even a grandparent who thinks that their own kids aren't raising the kid right. Most of the kids that are missing, remember when they had, some of you may be old enough to remember when there were missing children on milk cartons. And the implication was, at least the way most people interpret it, is these are kids snatched away. It turns out somebody did a study that almost all of them are runaways. These are runaways, and they were eventually came back. It is an extraordinarily, somebody calculated if you wanted to have a stranger snatch your child away, you would have to put your kid on the most dangerous corner in the world for something like 1 million years. I mean, it really is truly, I mean, you can get hit by lightning too, but these things, if we ran our lives on the basis of these tiny probabilities of what might happen, we wouldn't get out of bed. And then we would also realize it's pretty dangerous to stay in bed too. So we would just be absolutely paralyzed. We have to learn to think statistically and logically. Just because something happened and it was in the news and it made a big splash doesn't mean that this is something that is common or likely or that we should take into account in our own. Of course, it's important to teach kids safety rules about being outdoors. Of course, teach them. And kids can learn that. They taught us that in the 1950s. Teach you how to deal with traffic, how to look both ways before you cross the street. Teach them if somebody pulls up in a car and they invite you to get in their car and they're going to give you candy, don't do it. If they try to pull you in, scream at the top of your lungs. Everybody learned those lessons back then, and kids can still learn that stuff. So in the unlikely event that something like that happens, the kid is prepared and knows what to do about it. But instead now of instructing our children safety rules, we just deny them the opportunity to live their lives. We live it for them. We run their lives for them instead of allowing them to learn how to take care of themselves. So those are, the reason this happened in the 1980s is there were 2 cases that were big in the news, big precisely because they're rare, of course. This almost never happens, but there happened to be 2 cases, one in 1979 and one in 1980 of 6-year-old boys who were apparently snatched away by strangers. One of them was clearly murdered and the other one was never found. Now, no surprise, this made a huge splash in the news, and everybody became aware of it, and the parents made it a national cause. And so this is where the term stranger danger and all of that came about. It never came about because of any realistic scientific studies showing that this is a serious, likely problem that could occur. But it had a major effect on parents. It led parents to think that they are bad parents if they're not constantly watching their kids. It led Child Protective Services to believe that parents are negligent if they allow their kids to do the things that all kids used to do. And now that's one of the deterrents to parents for allowing their children to do the things that even the parents know is perfectly safe for the kids, but they're afraid somebody might call 911 or call Child Protective Services. There's, by the way, an interesting article on this very subject in this morning's Boston Sunday magazine by a law professor who's talking about the irrationality of the way Child Protective Services acts in Massachusetts and the deterring effect that that has on children's freedom. So these are things that we need to change. So over the same 70-year period that we've seen this decline in children's freedom, we have seen a gradual but overall huge increase in all sorts of psychopathology in childhood. The rates, some people have analyzed the scores on certain clinical questionnaires that have been given to normative groups of school-age children and teenagers over the decades, particularly in the 20th century, between about 1950 and the end of the 20th century. So, and what they have found, if you analyze those, what they have found is that if you look at these questionnaires, so for example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory has a scale for assessing depression in teenagers. And there's another test, Taylor's Manifest Anxiety Test, that assesses and what we today call generalized anxiety. And there are forms of this for teenagers. There's even forms of it for younger children as well. But the analysis of this shows that the rates of anxiety and depression rose steadily, almost linearly, over the years between 1950 and the end of the 20th century, such that if you look at the cutoff points on the scales for what would be likely major depressive disorder on the depression scale, or likely generalized anxiety disorder at a clinically significant level on that scale, you find that the rates of these disorders today are somewhere between 5 and 8 times what they were in the 1950s. This has been a gradual increase. This kind of problem was rare in the 1950s. It became ever more common over the same period of time that we were taking children's freedom away. It should be no surprise. If you look at the rates of suicide among kids, and most of these studies are with teenagers, younger children rarely commit suicide, partly because they don't normally have the means to do it. But if you look at the suicide rate among teenagers, it has increased fourfold since the 1950s, between 1950 and the end of the 20th century. It has, believe it or not increased a lot more since that time. A lot of the things that I'm describing actually had already manifested themselves by the beginning of the 21st century. We've had actually some improvement and some then worsening again, and I have a theory about that, which would be another talk and the subject of a book I have coming up, why things actually got better for a little while between the year 2000, between the year 1990 and 2010. I think it's because of the computer and the internet. Kids found a new way to play. and they found ways of interacting with one another, they found ways of hanging out. There was a kind of a regeneration of a spirit of childhood, and I think that actually resulted in some, it's the only explanation I can find for the improvement in mental health, not all the way back to the 1950s, but about a third of the way back. And then more recently, things got worse again, and I think that's because of Common Core and the changes that have occurred in schooling that have made schooling far more oppressive than it was before. And I document all of this in some articles and in a book that I have coming up. So that's just a preview. It's not something I'm going to belabor right now. So so what I want to talk about, so what I've described here is a correlation. So over a 70-year period, children's freedom has declined, and over that same period, children's rates of mental disorder and suicide have increased. And I'm suggesting that there's a cause-effect relationship to that, between them. To me, it almost seems obvious that there would be a cause-effect relationship between that. Children are human beings. Human beings like freedom. Human beings don't do well when their freedom is restricted. So it almost seems like something that shouldn't have to be proven. But yet, there's enormous amounts of both empirical and theoretical arguments for this cause-effect relationship. I've summarized those arguments in the first of the references. It's in the back of your handout, the article that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics in 2023, which I published along with a very well-known anthropologist who's probably the world's expert on children worldwide, and a cognitive psychologist who's written about the cognitive development of children in a number of textbooks and many articles. So if you want to look more at the details of the data regarding that, some of the other references regarding that would be a good article to get, and you can find that article on my personal website where you can download it. So let me though just summarize what I see as the evidence. The first point is really a no-brainer. Take away play, take away independent activity, and you've taken away maybe the primary source of children's pleasure. There's a famous I think there's a kind of an echo when I talk. Okay, if I talk a little softer, maybe the echo isn't there. So there's a famous play researcher, Brian Sutton Smith, who died a few years ago, and he used to say in his talks, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And I don't usually say that because the grammar doesn't work for me. But what I do agree with him is you take away play and you're going to get depression. There's no question about it. Play is the primary antidepressant for all of us, but especially for kids. So should be no surprise. But it's also the case in other independent activity. Watch kids when they do something independently. When they do an errand and come back, they're beaming. They're proud that they did this adult-like thing. And we're depriving them of the pride that comes, the feeling of power, that positive feeling of power, of empowerment that comes when children do things independently. So that's the first part. But in addition to being an immediate source of happiness, play, as I think I described when I was talking about play has the effect of building the character traits and the skills and the attitudes that are critical for meeting the bumps in the road of life. When children are playing independently, they are acquiring what psychologists call an internal locus of control. A more general term for it might be a sense of agency. I can do things. I can solve problems. Something can happen, and I can take care of it. That's an internal locus of control. And there are lots of clinical research, and there's a way of assessing internal locus of control with questionnaires. And a lot of research shows that those who have a strong internal locus of control, regardless of age, are far less likely to suffer from anxiety and depression than people who don't have a strong internal locus of control. Well, how do you develop a locus of control? You develop it by having control, by practicing control, by learning that you can solve your own problems. If you've been raised in a way that somebody else is always telling you what to do, always solving your problems for you, always protecting you, you can't develop a strong internal locus of control. And in fact, over that same period of time, in the second half of the 20th century, that anxiety and depression were increasing. Other studies, because this test for locus of control was also given to normative groups of school-age children, internal locus of control was continuously going down dramatically, such that by the end of the 20th century, on that locus of control scale, the average child at the end of the 20th century would have been at the 15th percentile in 1960, which was when that scale first began to be used. A huge decline in the sense that I can solve problems, that I can take charge of my own life. So we have here a cause-effect chain. Lack of opportunity to have control results in lack of a strong internal locus of control, which results in whenever you're now faced with anxiety-provoking bumps in the road of life, you fall apart, you panic, or you become depressed. So again, do we even need research to show us that? Shouldn't this be obvious? Yet there's lots of research showing it. The other point I want to make here is that psychologists have long talked about three basic human psychological needs that are important for mental well-being regardless of age, regardless of whether you're a child or an adult or an elderly person. If these three needs are not met, you're likely to feel anxious, depressed, unhappy, unwell mentally. So what are the needs? The first of these needs is autonomy, a sense of freedom, a sense I can make choices. I can do things I want to do. I'm not a puppet. I'm not a slave. I'm not a prisoner. We all need that. Anybody beyond the age of 4 needs a certain amount of that. The second characteristic is competence. Not only do we want to feel free to do the things we want to do, but we also want to be able to be good at the things we want to do. Competence. And the third characteristic is relatedness, is what they call it. It really means friends. We need friends. We need people in our cohort, in our generation. So we're not talking about parents now. We're not talking about teachers. We're talking about others. For kids, we're talking about other kids. We need a network of others who are in our generation who support us, who are part of our group. We're part of their group. That's crucially important, regardless of age, that there be people in your cohort that are your friends, that are providing emotional and sometimes material support for you as you're going along in life. And there are really literally hundreds of studies showing that if lacking any of these results in a decline in mental well-being, regardless of age. So how do children acquire these characteristics? They acquire them primarily in play. Play is autonomy. Play is doing what you want to do. For most kids, play is the only real realm of autonomy, and the rest of life, they're pretty much controlled by adults, either directly or indirectly. Play is also how children develop competence in what they're interested in. They play at the things they love to do, and they become good at that and develop a sense of competence as a result. And play is how children make friends. So for a child under 12, a friend almost by definition is somebody that you play with. So when we deprive children of free play with other kids, we're depriving them of opportunities to fill all three of the basic psychological needs that people of any age need in order to feel psychologically satisfied, to feel psychologically well. So and then in addition to that, there is empirical evidence on top of all of this. There's empirical evidence showing that, yes, indeed, when you do studies, first of all, correlating the amount of opportunity that children have for free play and independent exploration with other measures, you find, just as you would predict, the more opportunity they have for this, the better they score on these other measures. So some of these studies turns out are with 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds. And the way that the studies are done is that they have parents kind of keep a diary of the children's activities, of how much, and basically what the researchers are looking for in that diary is how much time in the average week does the child have for independent activity. Usually it's play of one sort or another, where there's no adult telling them what to do, no adult guiding them, no adult directly supervising them. So that's the measure of how much independent activity they have. And then independently of that, they have some kind of other measure. So there are at least 2 studies where the other measure comes from a test of executive functioning. Basically, this is a test of your ability to solve problems mentally, to take a problem, figure out a solution, and then follow through on solving other problems similarly to that. Not surprisingly to me, both of those studies found that the more independent activity that children had, in other words, the more time they had away from adults telling them what to do, away from adults instructing them, the better they were at this kind of mental test. Other studies look at teachers' ratings of some aspect of the child in school. So one study that I'm aware of, the teachers were asked to rate the children on their level of emotional maturity, their ability to sort of control their emotions. No surprise, those who had the most independent play, most independent activity, were scored higher by teachers' ratings on emotional maturity. Social ability, those who had more independent activity were rated better at social interactions, more socially competent than those who were more frequently guided and directed by adults. So we are constantly hearing messages, parents are constantly hearing messages about how they're supposed to be teaching and guiding their children all the time. What I'm describing is studies showing the reverse, that if by doing less for your kids, you are actually doing more. Because you are allowing them to learn that they can do things, they can solve problems, and you're improving their minds, you're improving their behaviors by doing that. So there are also studies, there are studies correlating, there are studies with adults, some studies do the following. You have a bunch of adults who sort of vary in their adult success, and independently of other measures of their adult, like are they happily married, do they have good jobs, are they satisfied with life as adults, and so on and so forth. Independently of that, you ask them to sort of write a little autobiography of their childhood. And then you analyze that little autobiography of their childhood to look for how much independent, especially adventurous, somewhat risky independent activity they were involved with as children. And I know of 2 studies of that sort, both of which show a strong correlation. Those who wrote stories that involve lots of independent activity are doing better as adults by these various measures than those who were more controlled as children. There are also studies of what's called helicopter parenting. There are questionnaires that researchers call them helicopter parenting questionnaires. I don't think it says that on the top of the questionnaire. It probably says parenting style or something like that. But they're basically questionnaires that parents fill out about how involved they are in their child's life. And it turns out that most of these studies are done with college students as the children, as the subjects. And it turns out that those college students whose parents were most involved in their lives are the ones doing the worst in college. They're suffering from anxiety, depression, doing more poorly in grades even in college than those whose parents were less involved in their lives, in controlling their lives. Now, of course, all these are correlations, and for any correlational study, you could always argue maybe the cause-effect is in the other direction. But when all of this converges, when all of these ways of thinking about it converge, we almost have to come to the conclusion that children who have more freedom and independence are going to be growing up better off in this world than children who are guarded and directed and pushed and controlled by adults as much as the average child is today. So now I want to go on to E. I'll just spend a few minutes there, and then we'll turn it over to questions and discussion. If I'm correct, we have about half an hour total time left. I want to devote at least 15 minutes of that to questions and discussion. But we're on E on the handout, and so I've listed here some items. E has to do with, so I've posed the problem, well, what can we do about it? What can various groups of people do it? So first of all, what can parents do? And so I've listed here the things that, some of the ideas that I think that of what parents could do. One is to certainly don't encourage and maybe discourage enrollment in a lot of out-of-school adult-directed activities. They're getting too much schooling already. Their schedules are too busy. So if your child really wants to be in an in a sport, in an organized sport, fine. Don't deprive them of it if they really want to do it. Sometimes I'm asked, well, how do we know if they really want to do it? And I think the best measure of that is if you have to remind your child when practices are. If you have to remind your child and take your child to get there, then your child probably isn't that interested in it. Children remember what's important to them. So one way to know is say, okay, yeah, it's fine that you can be in soccer, but I'm not going to be the one that puts it on my calendar and makes sure that you get there. You've got to do that. And if the child doesn't do that, the child forgets it, that's a pretty good sign the child isn't really all that interested in it. So that's one measure. And there may be even some cases where you would want to sit down with your child and say, you know, you really want to be in all these things? You know, they seem to be a little pressured by all these things. Have a discussion with it. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're doing it because they think you want them to do it. Maybe they're doing it because they have the misbelief that it'll help them get into college to do that. So I think sometimes just sitting down and talking with your child, you really need, kids are getting burned out by all this stuff. And we need to work towards reducing their involvement in all these other outside activities so that they've got more time for their own leisure, playful hobbies, and so on. So that's one thing. Another thing that parents can do is to have a conversation with your child about, it might go like this. So are there things that you would really like to be doing that kind of independently that you're not doing? That maybe, but for whatever reason, maybe you're not doing. Maybe you even think you're not doing because I wouldn't allow you to do it. But make a list. Come up with things you would really like to do. I'd be interested in what you'd really like to do. And parents who've done this often surprised by what the kids come up with. A kid will say, you know, I'd like to cook dinner. Amazing number of kids want to cook dinner. They've never been invited to cook dinner. Maybe they haven't even been allowed to cook dinner. Who wouldn't want their kid to cook dinner? But a more common thing might be, I want to be able to ride my bicycle by myself to my friend's house. I don't think you should have to drive me there every time. So there's actually a psychotherapist who's taken on what he calls independence therapy. So he works with kids who are anxious. So this is work with kids who already have a pathological level of anxiety. And what he does, the way he treats it, is exactly what I've just described now, but he does it as a therapist, kind of as an intervention between the therapist, between the child and the parent. So he'll say to, let's say, a little girl who suffers from anxiety and who has certain kinds of phobias or fears, he'll say, so let's not talk about the things that you're most afraid of. No sense talking about that. Let's talk about what you really would like to do that you're a little bit afraid of, but not so afraid of that you couldn't do it. Make a list of those things. And so it's amazing how quickly the children are able to make a list of such things once they start thinking of it. And then he invites the parent into the room and says, so here's a list of things that your daughter would like to do. As you look over the list, maybe check off the things that you would allow her to do. And so they come to an agreement, and maybe there's some negotiation and discussion, and then he gives the little girl an assignment to do these things that you want to do, and then to come back and report at their next session. He's got publications on this. This is a remarkably successful treatment for anxiety. As far as I can tell, the most successful treatment anybody has come up with so far. I'm suggesting you don't need to go to a therapist to do this. Any parent can do it. And even if your child isn't manifesting high levels of anxiety, this is prevention. To be able to come up with somewhat risky things, somewhat dangerous things, just slightly, enough that there's a little bit of fear involved, and then to say, yeah, go ahead and do it. And this has been very successful. We actually also do this in schools. In schools, the Let Grow organization brings into schools what they call the Let Grow, what Let Grow calls the Let Grow project. I think maybe Let Grow challenge would be a better term for it. But schools that adopt this, or it doesn't even take a whole school adoption, any individual teachers can adopt it. Usually these are elementary school teachers. And they give the children an assignment once a week to do something outside of school, independently, without an adult doing it with them, without an adult observing, something independently that they've never done before. Every week they're supposed to do something independently they've never done before. And they make a list of things that they would like to do, and then they go home and talk to their parent about what they'd like to do. Of course, the teacher says, I can't have you do things that your parent doesn't agree with, so you have to get your parent's permission to agree with. Now, the genius of this is, since this is a school assignment, the parents have to take it seriously. So the other thing that the teacher does in this case is sort of at least hint at how to negotiate with your parent. So if your parent says, no, I can't allow this, then talk about, is there some compromise? Is there something in between, something a little bit less adventurous that your parent would agree with? So for example, a 10-year-old girl might say, as my project, what I'd like to do this week is ride my bicycle all by myself to my friend's house 2 blocks away. And so she proposes this to her mom, and let's say her mom says, no, I can't allow that, that's too dangerous. And then the little girl says, well, if I can't do that, how about if I just ride around the block, once around the block, and you can sit on the front stoop and watch me go around the corner and watch me come back. And so the parent, maybe somewhat reluctantly, says, okay, I'll agree to that. And so they do it. She sits out there and watches the child go around. And the child comes back, and Lenore Skenazy, who's the president of Let Grow, has observed this directly. And what she finds is the little girl comes back just beaming with pride and happiness. She did this thing and lived to tell the tale. And here's the kicker, though. The mom is also beaming. She's proud that her daughter did this. And she's proud that she had the courage to allow her daughter to do it. Next week, this same mom is far more likely than before to allow the daughter to do what the daughter wanted to do in the first place. This breaks into this cycle of fear and restraint into a new cycle of pride in the child's abilities, instead of an increased cycle of feeling the child is fragile and needs to be protected all the time. So these are things that another thing that parents can do is to really actually, starting when they're toddlers, expect the child to be part of the housework team, not homework, housework, part of the domestic chores. Children actually, believe it or not, if they start early, feel good about being part of the team that takes care of. Nobody wants to be always on the receiving end of help and care. People feel good about helping. People feel good about contributing. I think that's part of why so many kids, turns out, want to cook dinner. They want to do, but if you start with, if you begin when the kid is already 10 years old or older, they may already have the attitude this is not their responsibility, and you might have to start bribing them or insisting. It becomes more work to get them to do it than its benefit. But here's the secret. If you start when they're toddlers, toddlers want to help. There's lots of studies show essentially every toddler wants to help. But parents in our culture often don't allow them to help. They sort of push them aside, because the help is not really help. It'll slow them down. And we're always in such a rush. But it turns out that there are other cultures that have learned the secret, that particularly some of the more close to indigenous cultures in Mexico is where these studies have been done, where the parents understand that if they allow their 2-year-olds to help them sweep the floor and clean up the dishes and all of that, the child gets at the very beginning the belief that I am part of the household management here. And by the time they're 5 years old, their help is real help. And by the time they're teenagers, they're still helping, and their help is even more real help. And they don't have to fight with their kids to do it. The kids have just grown up expecting this. We're doing children a favor by doing this. We're not imposing on them by doing this. We're doing them a favor because children feel better when they know they're contributing and not that they're just always receiving. None of us like to be always on the receiving end. It makes us feel weak, vulnerable, dependent. We want to feel like we can give, and this is as true for children as it is for adults. And the other thing that parents can do is to find, and this is a somewhat more difficult thing, find safe enough ways to bring children together. To play, safe enough in today's world usually means that there is an adult there for safety, one or more adults there for safety, but the adults there know not to intervene. The adults are just there like lifeguards on an ocean beach in case there's a real emergency. They're not there to tell the child how to play, not there to solve children's problems, not there to be targets for tattling and so on and so forth. They're just there for the sake of safety. The more opportunities we can create for that, and one kind of opportunity is Play Club in schools, where schools, before school or after school, have opportunities for all the children to play together. There's maybe a teacher or other monitors there just purely for safety who are taught not to intervene. While you're watching Play Club, you're not a teacher. Where you've got maybe 100, some of the schools have 100 or 150 kids all playing together, all ages from 5 to 11 if it's an elementary school, all kinds of ways of playing. This has been extraordinarily successful. Every school should have it. My dream would be that every school would have this opportunity after school, after every day at school, between the time when school ends and parents are home from work. That would solve the babysitting problem during that period, and it would give children 2 or 3 hours of opportunity to play every day, coming close to the amount of play that children actually need for healthy development. In an age-mixed environment, there'd be all kinds of different ways of playing. This would be one way. Lobby for that, lobby to get that going. There's also other opportunities for doing it, and instead of continuing that here, I'll move on. The other thing you can do, but before I move on to that, is that some parents, but it takes some initiative, have done this. So they find other parents in their neighborhood. They find other families in their neighborhood who have kids. They get to know those parents. And maybe they invite them over for a block party or neighborhood party, and they raise the point that, wouldn't it be great if our kids had more opportunity to play, real play, independent play, and could even maybe talk about how valuable that is. And some parents will be old enough to remember playing as kids themselves, and they'll want their kids to have this kind of opportunity. And so then you work out, so what if we did this? What if certain hours every week, maybe every Saturday afternoon and Wednesdays after school, we all acted like old-fashioned parents and kicked our kids out of the house, all of us. We all at the same time kicked the kids out of the house. They'll thank us for it after a while. They might resent it first. They want to stay on their computer, but we'll kick them out, just like old-fashioned parents did. And there will be, for parents who are worried about safety, let's have one person or two people out there for safety. My recommendation normally is that be a grandparent. But it should be somebody who's willing to be there, who's pretty relaxed, and who's not going to intervene and understands that intervening ruins play, but just there for safety. And there are neighborhoods who have done this, in a variety of neighborhoods, including a housing project, a low-income housing project in the Bronx, where they got the city to close off the street for this, and they got grandmothers to sit out there and make sure that it's safe, drive the drug pushers away, and so on, while the kids are playing. It can be done in any neighborhood, but it takes initiative for people to do it. Some parent has to get this going by bringing other parents to it. I'll be very quick with the other things. What can schools do? I've really already said that. I've talked about Play Club. I've talked about the Let Grow project in schools. Schools can do that. Schools should have far more recess than most schools have, and you could lobby for that in your school. What can public libraries do? Many libraries today, I did a survey, and one of the articles referenced in the back is a report in that survey of libraries a few years ago, and found that many libraries nowadays have makerspaces in them. This is constructive play with high-tech equipment. The primary users are kids and teenagers especially, and this is play. And the librarians are pretty good at just letting the kids do what they do. Most librarians don't know how to use that stuff, and they tell me, I don't really have to know how to use the stuff. The kids figure it out, or they teach one another. So, and also, libraries have worked out other ways of satisfying the need. Many libraries, including the library where I do some of my own work, have just teenage hangout places where the teenagers, one of the things, it's hard for teenagers to get together away from prying adults, and teenagers need to do that. So just having a kind of teenage room in the back of the library where they can talk with one another, they can play video games, they can do teenage things, talk about teenage things, is an extraordinary benefit for teens, having that in the library. And some libraries have a lot of libraries have play for little kids, but that's kind of parent-child play, and that's not really what I'm talking about. But some libraries have gone further. Some libraries have basically like Play Club at the library, where there's a library in Austin, Texas, that I gave a talk there years ago, and they followed up by developing Play Club at the library. So they open up I forget what day of the week it is, one day a week after school, between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening. They're open for free play at the library, both inside the library and outside, all kinds of equipment for play. Kids of any age can come and play, and parents, they have a little bookmark that they give to parents and instructions, and they'll talk with parents if parents don't get it, that parents are not allowed in the play area. There's another place for parents. Parents can be over here, and you can play games with other parents, or you can have parent snacks over here, and there's things you can do if you don't want to go home. So, and this has been extraordinarily successful. And they also now do it on certain weekends, and sometimes on school holidays. They'll be open pretty much all day for free play. This is something one can lobby with one's library. So I'm going to, I really want to leave time for a little bit of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to just move on and move to questions and answers. And if you have a question that pertains to what can youth sports programs do, what can local businesses do, what can town planners do, I would be happy to answer such a question, but I'd rather do it in question and answer at this point because I want to leave at least a little time for that. So thank you for your attention, and I would be.
When is the brain cooked for this skill set? And it's harder to modify.
So I have to confess to having somewhat of a hearing problem, and there's a little echo in that. Am I correct that what you're asking is sort of about age differences in opportunities for play?
A little bit. She was also saying that just when's the cutoff for these great skills they're learning at such a young age? Do they get to teenagers and you missed your window?
Okay, so no, I think that I've sometimes, years ago, because I'm also author of an introductory psychology textbook, I would be speaking to large audiences of freshmen at universities and talking about the importance of play. And I remember sometimes some kids would come up, these are freshmen in college, would come up and say, "Is it too late? I've never played." And so what could I say, right? Other than, no, it's not too late. I'm never going to say it's too late. Play is always valuable. It's valuable. You can always, it's really, I also sometimes talk to elderly people about the importance of play and keeping your mind active and so it's never too late. But I think what it is this. I think that if a child has reached the teenage years and they've really had very little opportunity to play, then the kind of thing that I was talking about talking with this child about what are some things you would really like to do, it may be a little bit different than trying to say, let's set up a play group, right? It's interesting what this library does that I was talking about. So they have this thing, and only little kids came. Kids, really elementary, the whole from preschool to elementary school. They weren't getting teenagers. So they did this, what I think, brilliant thing. They know that teenagers are looking for volunteer activities so that they can put it on their resumes for college, right? So they asked for volunteers, teenage volunteers, but of course all they're really asking them is for them to come and play with the kids. And so the teenagers, it turns out, once they start coming, love it. And they are really gaining from playing with the little kids. And some of these teenagers are kids who don't exactly know how to play, but little kids bring it out in them. Little kids haven't lost the energy. They've got the energy and the creativity, and it instills it, and maybe in kids, older kids who never had that opportunity. One of the things I observed at this ungraded school, where there are children there from 4 years old on to teenagers, sometimes you'd have a new student, a teenager come, and a new student there who'd be very sullen, kind of depressed, kind of the whole world sucks, and so on and so forth. And what I've observed is it's pretty hard for the teenager to hold that attitude when there's a 4-year-old wanting a piggyback ride. That little kids are just amazing at cheering teenagers up. So one of the things I think, if you want to call it therapy, you could call it therapy, would be to connect teenagers with little kids who will teach them how to play and will bring them into play. So that's the other thing I can say is that I think in the normal course of development, what we call play with younger children, and it's still play with older children, becomes more identifiable as hobbies when children are older. They get interested in certain things. It's a more formal activity. They're working at becoming good at doing this. And they benefit if they're working on doing this with a community of other young people doing it. And they are learning social skills in the process of doing that. I've also, again, sort of still on the topic of kids who, for whom play isn't so natural, I've also observed kids who are on the autism spectrum, and these are kids not very far out on the autism spectrum, but far enough out that they really don't initiate any kind of communication with other kids. And they've grown up not playing. And I've seen what happens when those kids, I've seen at least 2 cases of it, when those kids enter the kind of school that I did my study at, where there's a lot of kids playing, and I've seen how the other kids draw them out, not by trying to get them to do the things that the other kids are doing, but because the other kids are really interested in what the autistic kids are doing. So the cases that I observed were 2 boys in independent situations who were just on the computer all the time, playing video games, doing other things on the computer, and they were really good at it. And as a result of that, they were very attractive to the other kids who wanted to be involved in what they were doing on the computer. And by way of that mutual interest in the computer, the kid on the autism spectrum was pretty soon doing a lot of talking back and forth and had what we would call friends and was learning to communicate, learning to share ideas and so on and so forth by this shared interest. So I think that it's really important for kids as they become teenagers, number one, to have interests, to have things outside of school stuff that they have to do, things that they want to do, and to have ideally a community of other kids that they're doing it with.
Do we have any questions? We probably have time for one more. Any follow-up questions? Do you have a question? Sure. Oh.
Hello, I am a high school teacher and I get a lot of quote helicopter parents. And so what would be your advice to me if I have a struggling student and the parents' advice is like, oh, I'll just relearn the subject so I can help them with it. I recently had this conversation with a parent who has a junior in high school, so going off to college in 2 years, and my instinct is, she's gonna learn to do it by herself, but it's so soon, she's gonna be on her own soon. But of course, the more politically correct answer is, wow, what a great parent you are for helping her. So, any advice with that?
So I am going to have to apologize. I don't know if it's the sound system or my hearing aids, but what I'm hearing is a lot of echoes, and I'm having difficulty making out.
She is a teacher, a high school teacher.
Can you try saying it without the microphone?
Oh, sure. High school teacher, and she.
See, I hear it much better without the microphone.
Having some trouble with helicopter parents, and then how to actually interact with them versus trying to get them to not take over for their child when their child doesn't understand something.
Right. So how to deal with helicopter parents? I think that I think it's somehow a matter of education, and I think that if schools, among others, there are films about this. There are some great films. There's a film called Chasing Childhood that could be shown in schools about this. There are a number of other shows. There's a film that used to be very popular called Something to Nowhere. I forget how that. So there's those that could be shown at schools. You could have talks to parents at schools. I've been invited to talk to parents at many schools to to talk about. I sometimes am invited at prep schools so these are the most achievement-oriented parents in the world. And you can see how achievement-oriented they're because they're the only talks I give where they're sitting down, writing down everything I say. And then they'll ask a question like, oh, professor, how many minutes a day should my child be playing? Right? And they want a precise answer because they want to schedule it in to the child's busy day. And so I do get invited, and often I'm invited precisely because even though this is a prep school and they're pushing the kids, they feel the parents are pushing the kids more to a pathological, to what even the school thinks is a pathological level. And they want a professor there to calm the parents down. So among other things, I try to tell them that I try to present a lot of data, including developmental data and research data that shows that going to an elite college does not give the advantage that most parents think it does. And in fact, there's a lot of research, and I go into detail on this in some of my articles and blog posts, and present it when I'm talking to parents at a place like that, where they're all, these are parents who have written Yale or Harvard on the crib, and whichever way the child rolls, that's where the child will go. So that's those are the kind of parents that sort of especially need some calming down. And so it turns out there are studies done, in one of them by an economist and a statistician, that show that if you control for all the other factors like economic status of the family and various measures of motivation on the part of the child, and you control that way and statistically create what sort of statistical equivalent of identical twins, and you look at the one that went to an Ivy League school or one like that, and the one who went to just the local state college or university, by the time they're 40 years old, there's no difference between them, even in income, let alone in how happy they are. And so what people think of as a big advantage to going to an Ivy League school turns out to be kind of largely a myth. There is some advantage in that if you're looking for your child to become president of the United States or something, there's a bigger chance if they go to Harvard. But if you're within the 99.9% of the world, it doesn't make any real difference. So that helps. But I also think that the other thing that I often say to parents is this. I say, sometimes I'll say, close your eyes, and I want you to think about what really are your values, your honest, heartfelt values. And then I'll say, okay, so who wants to share their values? And what do people come up with? Being comfortable in your own skin, having friends, being a good neighbor, being a good parent. People don't come up with making a lot of money. People don't come up with made it into Harvard. People don't come up with those. And so then I say, so would you like your own children to live by those values? And then what is the best way for your child to manifest these values and develop these values? And then I can talk about play and exploration and learning who they are and so on and so forth. And then, just as the clincher, I'll point out, look, I have studied kids who haven't gone to school at all. And some of them, on their own initiative, applied to an Ivy League school and got in. They hadn't done any of the stuff that they're supposed to do to get in. So maybe we're even a little bit off center in our beliefs about what the admissions criteria actually are. Sometimes they're looking for somebody who is different, especially at these schools where everybody has perfect grade point average. Everybody's got the ceiling score on the SAT. I'm sure the admissions officers are bored to tears with those applications. And then they come to somebody who actually has a real interest. And they're talking about their interest. And they're saying, I think this school is where I can best pursue this interest and go into the career that I've decided is my dream career. And they can write a genuine, honest essay about why they want to go there. And I've seen quite a number of cases where that has worked out beautifully in terms of both the kids' development. And so even in terms of the things that parents are most concerned about, in this day and age for upper middle class and above parents who are achievement oriented, so many of them are irrationally oriented towards getting their kids into a fancy college, and they think somehow they think they are failures if the parents are failures if the kid doesn't do that. So these are important things to overcome. One other thing I do that's relevant is I sometimes talk to groups of camp directors. Camp directors, a lot of camp directors, at least the ones who invite me to their conferences, want camp to be a place for free play. But it's hard to get parents to pay money to send their kids to a place where they're just going to play. And so what I suggest to the camp directors is, number one, is they produce a good brochure about what children are learning, about what the lessons of play are: responsibility, democratic values, empathy, sharing, making decisions, executive functioning, all the things children learn about play. But in addition to that, I suggest to the camp directors that as part of the admissions requirement for camp, you have a meeting with parents who want their children to go there to really discuss what this camp is all about and the value of play, so that parents understand what they're getting into. So the other thing that happens, and this happens in schools as well, it could potentially even happen with Play Club, is that at schools, in camps, one of the things that happens is camp directors want kids to solve their own problems. They don't want to intervene every time there's a bit of a problem. But then the kids got the cell phone and they call their parent and they say, I skinned my knee and nobody's acting like this matters. Or somebody's been picking on me and the camp directors aren't doing anything about it. They're just telling me, so what do you do how can you solve this problem? So, and then the parents get really upset and they think the camp directors aren't doing their job. And so what I suggest to them is that's why it's really important you meet with parents in advance, that you're not being lazy as camp directors. This is part of your policy for a good reason. And this is also a reason to ban cell phones at the camp and to convince parents. Parents are the ones who want the kids to have cell phones so the kids can be in constant touch with the parents. But it's important that the camp directors convince the parents that there should be at least this period of time where the child is not in contact with the parents.
I'm going to hand